Thank you all for joining me. I really wasn't expecting such a great crowd. I wasn't sure how interested people were, or if people are interested as I am in the life of Laura Ingalls. My name is Meredith. I am one of the librarians at Mentor. I feel like I recognize at least some of you. You may recognize me. And so I'm going to be talking today about both the life and the legacy of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Before I jump into her life, I just wanted to show this painting. This is by Harvey Dunn. And he was a very well-known South Dakotan painter who was known for his pastoral landscapes of prairie life. And I think he does a really excellent job capturing both the beauty and the hardships of life on the prairie. And that feeling that you get when you look at this, you can see how lovely it is, but also you can kind of see how the woman's skin looks a little weathered and beaten from the elements. And that feeling, I think, is what Laura has captured in her writings. And it's that feeling that I kind of want you to think about as I go through this, because one thing to keep in mind, and it's been discussed even when her books were being published in the 30s and 40s, is that as much as these books are based on her memories and her experiences and her recollections, they are fiction. So they are her interpretation of those events, and it's that feeling of place that I think is important as we go through this. So, if you've wandered in here by accident and you don't know what we're talking about, Laura Ingalls Wilder is a very beloved children's book author. She was the author of 8, technically 9, books in the Little House on the Prairie series. The last book, the first 4 years, was published posthumously in the 70s. One of the things that kind of has been on my mind as I've been researching this is, what is it about her books that stick with us today, especially her earlier books, Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie. They really read like a series of chores, like that old adage, wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera. So what is it about that makes you and I interested in that? And I think part of it is a little bit of curiosity. Was it like to get along without electricity, without cars? But I think also a lot of it has to do with her strong sense of family. The Ingalls faced a number of hardships, but there was nothing that they couldn't get through without a little bit of pause fiddle music and the family, and they would just pick up and move on to the next great adventure. And that sense of togetherness is universal. That's something that we can continue to relate to no matter how many years pass. And her books they've never been out of print. They were published in the 30s, and they continue to be bestsellers into today. Yes? Yes, kids are still reading them. So it's not like just you and I have memories and nobody's reading them now. When I visited all of the sites that she lived at, and there were tons of young kids wearing bonnets, wearing braids, enjoying the experience of churning butter and living on a farm. So yes, these books are still part of growing up for a lot of kids, and I think that's great. Laura is about 18 in this photo. This was probably around the time she married Almanzo. But Laura's story almost really starts in the decades before she was born. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the interior of North America, which was known as the Louisiana Purchase. That was 530 million acres between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. In those following years, the American government made a lot of dubious treaties with the Dakota Indians, pushing them off their land, and settlers rushed to purchase those acres. In Minnesota, land was being sold for as low as $1.25 an acre. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran his presidential campaign. One of his many platforms was the free soil movement. He promised free land to all Americans. And that really tapped into that American dream that many immigrants had come over for. He made good on that promise, and in 1862, he signed the Homestead Act into law. And what that said was every citizen over the age of 21 who wanted to claim land was able to. That included single women, that included immigrants, that included free slaves, as long as you hadn't picked up arms against the United States. All you had to do was sign your claim, and you had 5 years to prove up on the land and build a home, and after that point, after a $10 filing fee, you were given the deed to the land. Unfortunately, that Homestead Act was seen as an act of declaration of war by the Dakota people, who were starving. They weren't getting the annuity payments that were promised by the government. And that same year, Dakota hunting party came across a few settlers and killed them. And at that point, the Dakota made the decision to attempt to push out the settlers from the Minnesota Territory. By the end of that year, the Dakota had surrendered to the US Army, but a lot of people on both sides had died. These atrocities were used to stoke fear in many of the settlers' minds. Politicians used a lot of rhetoric to get settlers to continue to push farther west. While this was happening in Minnesota, just across the river, the Mississippi River in Wisconsin, a family was welcoming their second child. Charles and Caroline Ingalls would be welcoming their daughter, Laura.
What year was that?
That was actually, 62 was the Homestead Act, and that war, 67 was when Laura was born. Yes, wonderful beard. This is Charles and Caroline. Charles Ingalls was born in western New York State. When he was a young boy, his family packed up and moved to Illinois before moving even further west into Wisconsin. That is where he met Caroline. Caroline was born in Wisconsin. Her father was a silversmith who actually died in a shipwreck, leaving her mother to raise 5 children under the age of 11. They had a number of very lean, impoverished years that was very difficult for the family and was the kind of thing that stuck with Caroline through her entire life. Charles's family purchased the property next to Caroline's, and in 1860, they were married, Charles having purchased some of that property for himself. In 1865, they relocated to a piece of property just outside of Pepin, Wisconsin, not too far from where Caroline's sister was living. And he built a cabin there. This is actually a map of US. This is where Pepin is. So he built them a cabin just outside of Pepin. This is obviously not the actual cabin. This is a replica of the Little House cabin in the big woods, which, as you can kind of see, aren't quite as big as they would have been at the time. In 1865, they welcomed their first child, Mary Amelia, here in this cabin. And as the Civil War was ending and the country was moving into a post-war recession, they had their second child, Laura. By the age of 3, they would move again. Now, if you are familiar with the Little House on the Prairie series, you might notice some of the chronology being shuffled, because Laura was in the first book, Little House in the Big Woods, about 5 before they moved to Kansas. But you'll see the way in which she has drawn from her memories to write these books. So after the family had debts, and after a series of financial dealings, Charles decided to move the family to Kansas. They spent a little time in Missouri, but there's just there's no record of what the family was doing at that time, and Laura's earliest recollections don't happen until 1870 when they're already in Kansas. Charles may have been familiar or may have heard that there was land available in this part of the country. There was an act, the 1841 Preemption Act. It was very much like the Homestead Act. It was federal land being offered to settlers. And so he was probably drawn into that idea of fertile lands free to all men. So they moved to a piece of land outside of what would become Independence, Kansas. However, he moved into what was at that point called the Osage Diminished Reserve. That was a 50-mile strip of land that was illegal for settlers to build land or build houses on. Even so, Independence is right about here, so they were looking just across the border of where that reserve started. He built a cabin there anyway. Again, this is another replica of what their farm would have looked like in Kansas. So the family lived here for about a year, and these memories that Laura had would become the basis of her third book, Little House on the Prairie. Farmer Boy is third, and that always throws me off. So the second book, Little House on the Prairie, here is where they had a number of incidents like interactions with the Indians coming into the home. The family was sickened with malaria and were treated by a neighbor doctor who was by the name of Dr. Tan. He was an African-American doctor who lived not far from where the Ingalls were living, and he treated them with quinine. And this is also where the family's third child, Carrie, was born. So here is, again, another photograph of what the Kansas prairies look like. Very, dry and barren. Yeah, the kind of land that you can basically see for miles, and there's nothing around. Still nothing around, really. Actually, there's a photo of Carrie. She's obviously a little older, but
Does anyone smile in all the photographs? I know they had to sit for a minute or something, but...
That's a good question. They do. I don't know if it might have been unpleasant to sit for that long. I think you're right. I think a lot of it had to do with you have to sit, so it's easier to just keep a neutral expression. But maybe, or less than neutral, unpleasant. Maybe she just didn't really enjoy having her picture taken. After about a year, the family, there were federal troops in the area, and there was probably a lot of confusion about the reserve and where these families were allowed to settle. And Charles may have thought that they were about to be kicked off of their land. That may not have been true. I don't think that federal troops were planning on removing any white people from any settlement in that part of the country. But regardless, Charles packed up the family and they moved back to the big woods of Pepin. And they moved right back into that cabin. They hadn't sold it at that time. They had only mortgaged it to an immigrant. So they were able to move back right into that cabin. And Laura, who was a little bit older now, at this point, these are where those memories were coming in that made up the bulk of Little House on the Big Woods. So if you're familiar with that book, You may remember such stories as Slaughtering Day. I know that's, when I talk to people, that's the one that really sticks out in people's minds, when their father blew up the pig's bladder and let Mary and Laura pat it around like a balloon. So people really remember that. There was also the sugaring days, where the family went to make maple syrup with their grandparents and had a big party about it. So the Wisconsin, the big woods, it really was the backdrop for quite an idyllic childhood for her. This is Lake Pepin. This is where Laura, they would go when they were visiting town as a kid. Again, another story you may remember, when Laura and Mary were picking up stones on the shores, and Laura was sticking them into her pocket, and she filled her pockets up so much to the point where the seam ripped out and her pocket tore from her dress. So that happened here on the shores of Lake Pepin, which is actually not a lake. It's just the widest part of the Mississippi River. So this is actually the Mississippi. That instance with the pocket is an example of Laura casting herself as the naughty child, the child who had trouble following rules. And that was something that is consistent through most of her writing, and it was something that really stuck with her. She always felt second to Mary. Mary was the good daughter. Mary was the one who had the best manners. Mary was the one who followed the rules. Mary had the beautiful blonde curls. And Laura really sort of struggled with that role, that dichotomy between the good sister and the naughty sister. And it stuck with her, and especially when Mary went blind later in life, those expectations of Mary's life fell to Laura, and it was not necessarily a role that she felt comfortable stepping into. I think it's worth noting an interesting fact. A few miles north of the cabin that the Ingalls lived in, a few 20-ish miles, another girl was being raised on a farm. Her name was Carolyn Woodhouse Watkins, and her granddaughter would go on to write a book about her life that was called Caddy Woodlawn. So some of you might be familiar with that book. Yeah, that happened, that was about the same time that Laura was also living in Wisconsin. So a few years go by, the price of wheat was starting to fall. It was difficult for Charles to get his crops to someone who would buy them. There was no railroad in this part of the country at the time. He decided that he was going to find something better. Laura would attribute this wanderlust to the fact that the big woods were getting crowded. The population in Wisconsin at that time had gone from about 70,000 to over 1 million, so there were definitely people coming in, and she believed that her father was always looking for, wide open spaces. He didn't want neighbors within miles of their land. So they would leave, but it meant leaving an established home. They had family there, they had plenty of game, they had a nice life, so it was hard. But they did pick up and move to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. They spent that first winter in a dugout. This is the site of where the dugout was, and unfortunately you can see the sign at the top of the hill. It is collapsed, but you can see the way it was here on the banks of Plum Creek, hence the title of that book, On the Banks of Plum Creek. Dugouts were very common in this part of the country at the time. This is a photo of what a dugout might have looked like. They were very practical to build in those treeless prairies, and they were also very cheap to build. They did offer some climate control, but they were crowded, they were prone to flooding, and personally I think they were made of dirt, so that's also sort of a downside.
Came with a swing.
Yeah. You also notice that there was also a good chance of a horse or an ox to put their hoof through the roof. So not my first choice of place to live, but they did live there. Laura and Mary did have a nice time. You can see here are the beautiful fields and hills of the Minnesota Prairie. And while they ran and had fun, their father planted a crop of wheat that he would hope to bring the family prosperity. Here is also where Laura met her first nemesis. If you are familiar with books or the TV series, you may recognize the name Nellie Oleson. Nellie Oleson was actually an amalgam of a couple of different girls that Laura butted heads with and didn't like very much. This girl in particular, her name was actually Nellie Owens, so very, very subtle change there, not quite hiding her identity very much, but she was the daughter of a shopkeeper. But she was, according to Laura, a vile and unpleasant girl, and Laura had no problem and felt no remorse for tormenting her by throwing crawdads at her when they were hanging out and playing in the creek. So in the 1870s, these were some of the driest years on record. And that ended up sort of laying the foundation for a really unexpected tragedy for the family. One of the most vivid stories on the banks of Plum Creek was that of the swarm of locusts. Because of that drought and because of the wild grasses and plants were all dead, the locusts went for the next best thing they could find, which were those, green crops of wheat. When the locusts came, it was an unstoppable swarm. There was nothing that could be done. And this swarm that the Ingalls encountered was the largest swarm of locusts in recorded human history. They estimate it was probably up to 3.5 trillion insects that just cut a swath from one part of the country to another. They tried lighting fires, smoking them out. They tried covering the crops with burlap, and the insects just ate right through it. And really, in an instant, their whole livelihood was destroyed. Ironically enough, if they had stayed in Wisconsin, they would have been spared. That swarm did not cross the Mississippi River. You'll notice that one of the recurring themes in their life was just sort of encountering unfortunate tragedies like this, but they continued on. The next period in Laura's life was one of the, it was a point that diverted from her books. And it was one of the darkest periods. Nellie Oleson, we'll skip that. It was one of the darkest periods in her life. And if you are very familiar with the books, it may surprise you to find out that the family lived in Iowa for a short period of time. This was not something Laura ever wrote about because it was so unpleasant for her to remember. Charles made a deal with a man by the name of Stedman to become partners in the hotel business in Burr Oak. So in 1876, the family moved out of Plum Creek and headed to Iowa. At this point, the family finally had their first boy, a child they called Freddie. But in the months that they were traveling, Freddie died, and they had to lay him to rest and unfortunately continue on without him. Burr Oak was a dark and dirty place. It was not a place they enjoyed living. Walnut Grove was a new town, so it was shiny, it was pleasant to live in. Burr Oak had a saloon, had a hotel, and it exposed the girls to all manner of unsavory behaviors. There was public drunkenness, there was wife beating, there were fights, they were exposed to diseases like measles. And the children were tasked with helping their mother serve diners in the hotel. And working in the business ended up being a real disappointment for, let me skip ahead. That's the Master's Hotel that they worked in. This is actually the building that is original to the time period. They were not partners. Charles was not a partner to the Stedmans. They were basically treated like servants, and it was really awful time. Here is actually a photograph from about the 1880s, and you can kind of see, this is another shot of the hotel. You can see the way the building still pretty much looks the same. The family had their final child here in Burr Oak. This is Grace. She was their final daughter. And they continued to rack up debts, grocery debts, rent, and hospital bills from the delivery of Grace. It was so bad that the doctor who they owed money to actually offered to take Laura as payment. His wife wanted a child to help around the house. To Caroline's credit, she delicately rebuffed that offer. But that was something that really stuck with Laura as a really unpleasant thought. She wrote, and I'm just going to quote here, "Whenever I thought of her, the woman who wanted to adopt her, the queer feeling came back. Mrs. Starr might have taken me away from my family. It seemed strange, and I always tried to forget about it as quickly as I could." So that's not something that she enjoyed thinking about. So Charles attempted to negotiate with their landlord to try and work some deal out with paying back their debts, but this man refused to budge. So Charles came up with his own solution, and one day in the middle of the night, he packed up the family and they left, leaving their debts behind them. And they went back to Walnut Grove. Unfortunately, Walnut Grove was not the idyllic place that they had left, because the family who started the Master's Hotel, the Master's family, they had swapped places with the Stedmans. So the Stedmans were running that Master's Hotel in Iowa, and the Masters moved to Burr Oak and opened another hotel with a saloon. So again, the children were exposed to lots of unsavory behaviors. Laura was stuck dealing with Nellie Owens again. And worse, her second nemesis was Genevieve Masters, who was part of that family who had come to build the hotel. And Genevieve was from New York, so she really didn't care for the Western kids, and they felt that their clothes were old-fashioned, and she was very unpleasant. She would tease Laura, but Laura could give as good as she got. So she would pit Nellie Owens against Genevieve for their favor, and so they would end up fighting for Laura's favor, and she sort of became the queen bee of the Walnut Grove. The family was actually pretty much homeless at this point. They rented a few different places. They didn't have a homestead or anything of their own. And unfortunately, at this point, this is Mary. Mary started to get sick. She suffered from really severe fevers and headaches, and Laura would eventually attribute this sickness to scarlet fever. It was probably more likely some sort of encephalitis, swelling of the brain that damaged the nerves in her eyes, and probably brought on by a bout of measles that she never fully recovered from. And she actually suffered a number of strokes at this time, which was really terrible, and they weren't sure if she was going to recover, but she did. Unfortunately, she did go blind at this point. And this was a very tough blow for the family. They had a lot of hopes and expectations about Mary's ability to provide for the family. They were expecting her to become a teacher, and that salary would have really helped the family, go on. So those expectations eventually, and the care of Mary, she wasn't really at this point able to do much of anything for herself. A lot of that fell on Laura. Again, at this point, Charles got a job working with the railroad, and he moved out west working to build that, and the money was some of the best money he had been making in his entire adult life. So he decided to pick up the family and move them even further west. So they moved about 100 miles west into the Dakota Territory. This move took them past any established towns. This was Wild West country. They ended up staying in the railroad workers' camp. And Laura picked up and helped her mother, again, cooking and serving food to the railroad workers. And this is where there was plans for a town to be built, not that the town had been built yet at this point. This is, again, about 1879 we're at. The camp was a rough place, and by the winter, all of the workers packed up and left. They didn't spend the winter in this part of the country because there was nowhere to get supplies. There were no towns, the railroads weren't really built to get this far out yet. But Charles was actually hired to stay on for the winter and be a caretaker for the surveyor's house in this town. So Charles and his family stayed here, and they were actually the first family to stay in this part of the country through the whole winter. There were a few other people, homesteaders, trappers, but there was nobody living for miles and miles in this part of the country. This is Silver Lake. It's not, unfortunately, much of a lake anymore. It's kind of more of a marsh.
Did you take that picture?
I did take this picture.
Your shadow?
Probably my shadow. Yes, any of the location photos were taken by me. There's another shot of Silver Lake. So these memories, again, were the foundation of On the Shores of Silver Lake. That would be, Laura riding bareback with her cousin Lena, hanging out in the railroad camps. Luckily, that winter was very mild. So Carrie and Laura spent a lot of that time running around. They would, when this was a lake, they would run and slide across the frozen surface of the lake. They saw wolves, and actually not a too unpleasant time for the family.
And what year would that be?
This would have been probably 79 or 1880 would be my guess.
That was an actual lake?
This was a lake at the time.
Was it drained naturally?
I'm not sure. I've found conflicting reports about what happened to the lake. I think it might have been partially drained intentionally. I don't know if they were trying to build on it at some point, but I've also heard people say that there are actually parts of it that are lake-like, depending on, I think, where you are and how much rain there's been, but it mostly looks like this. There's a lot of cattails. It's like a cattail marsh. So as the winter gave way, the family did move on to their homestead claim. And here is a photograph of their farm in De Smet. So they worked to build their home because they were afraid of claim jumpers, the kind of people who there had been, stories of people who would be murdered for their land. So the family wanted to be sure to establish their residency on this claim. At this time, there was also this photograph was taken. This is the only surviving photograph of their childhood. I really like this photograph because I think of the way that I feel like it speaks to the character of the children. So we've got Carrie on the left. You know, Laura always described her as being sort of pale and sickly, and you can kind of see her drawn features. She's wearing what is most certainly a hand-me-down dress that she is absolutely drowning in. You have Mary sitting demurely in the middle, and Laura on the, that's my right, who's got sort of very sort of defiant look upon her face, sort of eyes cast to the side. And another thing that I like about this photograph is that you can see this extra piece of fabric that's been sewn onto her dress that's obviously to extend the life of it, that she's obviously outgrown, which is kind of funny because Laura was only about 4'11", so.
Could you repeat what year Laura was born in?
Laura was born in 1867. So yeah, she would have probably been about 16, 15 in this photograph, because this is De Smet. That would be my guess.
Is this before her sister is blind?
This is, I think, about when she would have been blind. So she might have been, I'm guessing Mary would have been about 15 and Laura might have been 13 or 14 would probably be.
Grace was how much younger?
Grace is not in this photograph. Carrie is, I think, 2 years younger, 2 or 3 years younger than Laura. Okay. So they're living in De Smet on their homestead, and that year, winter blows in way earlier than anyone expected. The blizzards began in October of this year, and it caught everyone completely unaware. And about 100 people ended up being trapped in the town of De Smet at this time. Weather and snow and blizzards raged through this area. Men tried to clear the snowdrifts off of the tracks, but the wind would just blow it right back. The last train got into De Smet in January of 1881. And supplies were quickly depleted in this town. There was no meat, there was no butter, there was no sugar, there's no coffee. People started to burn hay to try and stay warm after the coal burned out. Caroline took to grinding the wheat seed and using that to make bread. By late January of 1881, the situation was extremely dire. It could have been very severe had there not been a rumor that a farmer nearby had actually managed to harvest a crop of wheat. But to actually go out and get the crop of wheat was going to be just as dangerous as sitting around and waiting for something else to happen. There were whiteout conditions happening every other day. So eventually 2 volunteers came forward and said that they would go out and get this wheat. And those men were Cap Garland and Almanzo Wilder. Almanzo arrived in De Smet around 1879 with his brother, Royal. They were from a very prominent, wealthy New York farming, not wealthy, but well-off farming family. And they wanted to take advantage of the Homestead Act. Almanzo probably fudged his age a little bit. He was only 20 at the time, so he changed his birth date to make him seem 2 years older so that he could get land. That is how he came to be in De Smet. So Cap and Almanzo hitched up their horses and went out to find this farmer. And he didn't want to part with his wheat but they actually managed to convince him to sell, especially knowing how dire the situation was for the people of De Smet. And they managed to save the town. This was the defining moment of the long winter that book Laura wrote. And because it wasn't until May that trains were able to make it into De Smet with supplies. Yeah. Over the next couple of years, the family actually managed to make enough money to send Mary to the Iowa School for the Blind so that she could learn how to care for herself, learn Braille. Laura continued to quarrel with Genevieve Masters and Nellie Owens, and especially with her school teacher, Eliza Jane Wilder, who was Almanzo's sister. She was not a very good teacher. There was one particular scene where Eliza Jane was attempting to punish Carrie for making some noise during class, and Laura was not having any of that. She stood up and immediately started shouting back at Eliza Jane. This is a photograph of the downtown of De Smet. These buildings right here on the end, these are original to Laura's time period. Those buildings have stood since the 1880s and are still there. Another shot, this is the bank that Charles did his banking at, on the right of what it looked like then and what it looks like today. It's still there. So when Laura turned 16, she got her teaching certificate. Which was actually 2 years younger than you were supposed to be. You were supposed to be 18 to get your teaching certificate in South Dakota, but there was a position opened and they didn't have anyone else. So she took her test and got her certificate, and she was hired to teach at a school a few dozen miles away from her family in De Smet. Her family really needed this, even as much as Laura didn't want to do this. She didn't want to be a teacher. She didn't like public speaking. She wasn't suited for it, but she did it anyway. Charles was working carpentry, trying to harvest his own crops, and they just didn't have enough money to buy that farm equipment that they really needed to make a living. But this situation was still less than ideal for Laura. She was young, she was inexperienced, and she found it very difficult to manage this even small group of kids who quickly realized that they didn't have to listen to her. And to make matters worse, she was also staying with a family nearby during the weeks, or was planning on spending her time there for her semester. And the wife of the Boucher family, Liv Boucher, was suffering from what they called Prairie depression, just sort of being out in the middle of nowhere, having very little to do. And this caused her to fly into a number of rages, and Laura was sort of stuck listening to her argue and berate her husband. So it was a very welcome surprise that after that first week, Almanzo Wilder showed up in his sleigh to take her home. Laura, to her credit, told him that she was only taking advantage of his rides because she wanted to go home and that she had no interest in his affections. But he didn't mind. He continued to show up every week after week to pack her up in the sleigh and take her home. That even included one day when the temperatures had dropped to -45. Almanzo was actually standing around debating whether or not he should hitch up the horses and go get her, when Cap Garland rode by and saw his sort of unsure nature and shouted, "God hates a coward." So he packed up and went and got her, and it was very cold. He kept having to stop to clear the horses' noses that were getting frozen, but they made it home. After her teaching was done, she continued seeing Almanzo. They went for rides on his sleigh, and There was one instance when she had thought she maybe wanted the affections of Cap Garland, but when it came to it, she kept accepting rides from Almanzo. And in fact, one day, she was waiting to get picked up when she noticed that Almanzo had another girl in his sleigh, Stella Gilbert. And she had sort of played on Almanzo's sympathies, but Laura quickly put a stop to that, telling Almanzo he needed to pick. And in 1884, they were married. Laura was 17 at the time. Also, here's a photo of the whole family. So after Almanzo and Laura were married, they moved on to his claim. He had a tree claim that he had built, probably the finest home that Laura had lived in. She writes very fondly about it, saying it was a home with 3 rooms, clean pine floors, and had custom-built cabinets and drawers in the pantries for her to put all of the kitchen supplies. They had a pretty calm, nice first year, but Laura was concerned about money, which she had every right to be, as she learned Almanzo had a lot of debt on the house. He took out a lot of money to build that house, and they still owed about $500 on that home he built. As the first couple years went on, there was a lot of bad weather. A lot of their crops were destroyed by hail, which made it really hard to harvest. And then in 1886, Laura gave birth to their first child, Rose. A year later, Almanzo and Laura were struck down with diphtheria, and when they discovered that that's what it was, Rose was quickly sent to live in town with her parents, with Laura's parents. At that point, Charles and Caroline and Mary and the other children had moved into a house in town that Charles had built. Charles was getting up in age and was just not able to keep up with the amount of work that it took to keep that homestead.
What city is this now?
This is still DeSmet. Yeah, they would, Charles and Caroline and Mary would all live here until their death. So this is
the house was that big?
Yes, this is the house that Charles built in town. Yes.
That's the house. If you drive out I-90 West,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get on the Ingalls Wilder scenic highway,
Mm-hmm.
That's the town you would see if you followed the signs to her homestead?
Yeah, so that road you're talking about, that's the one that runs from Walnut Grove to DeSmet, South Dakota.
I wasn't allowed to go to her homestead. My husband's like, I got you on this highway, and that's not.
Yeah, there is a highway that runs from Walnut Grove, Minnesota to DeSmet, South Dakota, because it's almost like a straight line between the two. And so those pictures I showed, the one with the bank and the one with the 2 buildings, that's this town. So this is all that town and the surveyor's house, which I think they actually picked up and moved, but that surveyor's house is also now in the town of DeSmet. Rose was sent away, and they did recover, but it took a while, and unfortunately, Almanzo suffered some paralysis in his legs, probably because he, had to get up and work, and he didn't give himself adequate time to recover. He would regain use of his legs, but it would plague him the rest of his life. The next couple of years were still very difficult for the families. Again, severe weather and drought caused crops to fail. Laura got pregnant for a second time, but their son died just a few days after he was born. They didn't even have a chance to name him. And then the final straw for the family was one day Laura was building a fire in the stove, had gone into another room to do something else, and when she'd returned, the fire had basically engulfed the whole area, and it burned the house down. So they took some time to to think about what they wanted to do next. They actually moved to Florida for a very brief period of time.
That's them.
This is Laura and Almanzo in Florida. At the time, it was believed that the climate would help him recover the use of his legs, but I think, as you can tell from this photograph, they hated it. Absolutely hated it. They hated the climate, they hated the people, they thought the people were weird, they hated the insects, the giant bugs around, so they did not spend a very long time in Florida.
Did the daughter go with her?
Yes. The daughter, Rose, did go with them.
All these pictures, or,
Uh-huh.
the real pictures, where did those come from? Did someone, save them?
Yeah, the Laura, as I'll get to, they moved to a home in Missouri and they stayed there. So all of those belongings they had were hers and they're in the house. So after Florida, they moved back to De Smet and stayed with their family for a little bit. I'm gonna actually shoot back to this photograph because this is when this one was taken.
So who's in this picture?
So we've got Caroline, Charles, Mary, and then we've got Carrie, Laura, and Grace standing. Yeah, so the whole family is here. Freddie died.
I'm sorry.
I don't think they knew because he was only about a month old. So they said he just sort of started seizing and died. So yeah, he was buried in Iowa. So after staying with the family for a little bit, they probably saw an ad for land in the Ozarks. And they made the decision to have a move out to Missouri. Laura had Charles play his fiddle for her one last time, and then Charles gifted the instrument to her. So she had possession of the fiddle, which is probably why it's still around. So they moved to Missouri. I don't know how long, it probably months to travel by wagon from especially a distance like this. It's kind of the thing that makes this so interesting for me and the idea of pioneer living, because I just can't imagine what it would be like to have to pack up all of your things into a wagon and just ride on. I think Laura wrote a journal of their travels between De Smet and the Ozarks, and I think she described it as just being like unbearably hot in the wagon. So I can't. It's so impressive to me that people were able to endure this and do it willingly. At this point, so they get to the Ozarks. They find a piece of property that they want to buy, Laura and Almanzo, and they do. They buy what they will eventually call the Rocky Ridge Farm, and they're not able to move onto it right away. They stay in Mansfield as the town. They stay in the town. They work. They do take odd jobs to make the money in order to build their home. At this point, I want to spend a little time talking about Rose, because Rose, as you will find out, was instrumental in the publishing of not only getting her mother to write, but the publishing of the Little House books. Rose was always an ambitious individual. She was intelligent, she was headstrong, she was opinionated. She disliked school because she didn't like, I think, the idea of having to listen to her teachers who she felt were not as smart as she was. And Rose was not the kind of person to suffer fools. She did eventually finish her schooling. She did so in Louisiana. She spent some time with Eliza Jane, who was Almanzo's sister, who Laura really didn't like, so probably wasn't quite a huge fan of the fact that Rose was spending time with her. And Eliza Jane was not a very good or attentive chaperone. Rose got a little bit of a reputation as the kind of girl who might stay out all hours of the evening doing,
Hanging out with-
yes, well, this is a photograph that I really like. This is Rose as a child in Mansfield, Missouri on the Rocky Ridge Farm. This is her donkey, Spook and Dyke. And as you can see, again, Rose did not like this donkey. It was purchased for her by her father to ride to school, but it was such a stubborn animal, she almost always spent her time pulling it behind her. She also didn't like it because it really made her stick out as one of the poor children in the school because they all had horses. And she was stuck with this donkey. Yes?
Was Alonzo Wilder, was he Latino?
No. Are you asking by the name Almanzo or?
And the complexion she has.
No. The name Almanzo was actually. So he was one of 5 children. His older sister was Laura, which is why he called Laura Bess, and she called him Manly. And so Laura, Royal, Eliza Jane, and then him, Almanzo, and then their younger brother, Pearly Day. And the name Almanzo actually, according to his family legend, there was a member of his family who fought in the Crusades and encountered a man by the name of El Manzor. So, and then that name sort of came back with the member of the family and sort of was passed down. So that's the family legend of the name Almanzo. There was also at the time a series of stories that ran in like a magazine that his mother may have read about like a Moorish man, like an illicit love affair between a Moorish man and a woman, and that character's name was Almanzor. So it's also possible that she got that name from the magazine as well. But according to his family, it came from the Crusades.
What did you say his younger brother,
Pearly Day.
Pearly Day?
Pearly Day was his younger brother. Yes, that was another family name. I think they named him after like a well-known member of their family that was successful. I think Royal stayed in Desmet. I actually don't know as much about the Wilder, the rest of the Wilder family. So I'm not entirely sure if he stayed. So once Rose did finally graduate, she moved, she left. She was not interested in staying on the farm. She went to Indiana to manage a Western Union and work in the telegraph office. And it was there that she met a man by the name of Claire Gillette Lane. And Lane was swift-talking newspaper man. He sold newspaper advertisements, he sold newspaper subscriptions, and together they went to San Francisco. And his connections in the newspaper business got her a job at the San Francisco Call. So that's the beginning of her career in the newspaper business. Rose and Claire were married in 1909. Laura and Almanzo were not in attendance, nor had they even ever met the man. And according to Rose, the marriage was unhappy from the start. She fully admitted that they really didn't have anything in common beyond physical attraction. In the first year of their marriage, Rose got pregnant but had a miscarriage, and she never had children throughout her life. So.
Are Charles and Carolyn dead by now?
Not yet. Charles would be the first of the family to die, and Laura would go during this period. So basically we're talking about 1901 through about 1930. During these couple of decades, Laura and Almanzo, they settled and they wanted to stay there. So they didn't do much. They didn't do a lot of traveling. They stayed and worked on the farm. Laura did go home for Charles's funeral. She rode the same railroads that Charles helped build to go back. I don't think that she would end up returning for her mother's funeral or Mary's. This is the Rocky Ridge farm that Laura and Almanzo lived in the entire rest of their lives. And that's another shot of it. And actually, this is the shot of the acreage that the house is on.
Was their house, is it still in that her family?
It's owned by it's not owned by the Wilder family, but it's owned by the museum family. It's owned by the Laura Ingalls Museum, Foundation. So Rose was a self-trained journalist. She didn't go to school, and it meant that she was not very interested in journalistic ethics. She was not interested in reporting facts. She was really interested in creating truths for her own gain. She would end up taking a lot of her mother's stories that she was told and rewrite them as first-person accounts and memoirs and have those published in different newspapers and publications. She was also known to be an author of a number of lurid, unauthorized biographies of celebrities like Charlie Chaplin, Henry Ford, and Jack London. And those would, she would get sued by Charlie Chaplin, sued and her publisher, and got them to stop the publication of these biographies just with completely made up facts about their life. Rose did not care. That was very much her MO. For her credit, though, Rose did encourage her mother to write her own stories. And Laura got a job writing for the Missouri Ruralist, which was a pretty well-known farmer's publication. So she had a long-running column about being a farmer's wife and about various tips and just her experiences living on a farm. The thing is, though, Rose had a very contentious relationship with her mother and her parents. She let her criticism of them flow freely in her letters to them. And it's hard to say whether it's because she felt that they were disappointed in her for not getting married and settling down. Rose was well divorced at this point. Or that Rose just completely rejected their way of life, their sort of spendthriftness, their being content to just settle, because Rose was a world traveler. She traveled her entire life all over the world. So in the mid-1920s, Rose also felt the need to make her parents or have her parents sort of be dependent on her. They didn't need her money, but she agreed to, or she willingly sent them about $500 a year, even though they didn't necessarily need it. And she also decided to build them a new home on the Rocky Ridge farm. It was a kit from Sears, and she hired an architect to make very expensive additions to it, and the final cost ended up being about $5,500. But when it was all said and done, it ran upwards to about $11,000 to build what they would call the Rock House. So this is within walking distance of the Rocky Ridge home that Laura and Almanzo were perfectly happy to live in. This was completed in 1928. Laura and Almanzo lived in it for a little bit, but not long, and their rejection of that was yet another slight that Rose felt was put onto her by her mother. Rose was one to hold a grudge. She was not one to let anything go. And these sort of perceived slights against her really continued to build and build throughout her entire life. In late 1928, around the same time, a little bit after the completion of this home, Mary died at the age of 67. And this death really affected Laura, because Laura had always wanted to memorialize her family in some way. And with Mary dying, it really made Laura, who was about 65 years old at this point, realize that it's possible that time was running out and that it was time to do something about it. So Rose, who was had returned, she had been in Albania for a while. Rose had returned back to the Rocky Ridge farm and was in the midst of severe depression and was in serious debt. She convinced her mother to write her memoir. And that first attempt at writing a memoir would be called Pioneer Girl. It covered the first 18 years of Laura's life, beginning with her earliest memories in Kansas and through the first year of marriage to Almanzo. Laura gave it to Rose, and Rose passed it on to her agent. But her agent didn't think that it would sell. He didn't think anybody would be interested in buying it. So Rose attempted to make some severe edits to manuscript. As was her wont, she added that the family had encountered the notorious Prairie serial killer, the Bloody Benders. And she thought that would make it sell better, but again, people were not interested in it. A year later, she got the idea to pass it on to a children's book editor, and a man by the name of Marion Fiery, who was working for Knopf at the time, he got a hold of it, and he read it, and he liked it, and he thought that if she could expand on some parts of it and make it for kids aged about 8 to 12, that they might actually be able to sell it. So she did. Laura began writing what would become Little House in the Big Woods. And the way that this process worked, and it worked for this book and it worked for the rest of her books, is that Laura would handwrite her memories and stories in little tablets, and then Rose would take it. And Rose would be the one to sort of add those literary touches. She would tie the stories together a little more cohesively. And then, Laura would take it back and they'd have an argument over removal of one thing, addition of another thing. And then finally they would have a complete manuscript and it would be submitted. And they would submit these manuscripts without acknowledging any of Rose's contributions. So while there have been rumors that Laura did not write the Little House books at all, that's untrue, because there are tons of handwritten manuscripts by her own hand. But it can't be ignored that Rose did a significant amount of work, and that these books really were a collaboration between mother and daughter. So in 1931, she submitted the final manuscript. And in 1932, Little House in the Big Woods was published with illustrations by Helen Sewell. And Laura would end up spending the next decade writing her books in very much the same way. Rose would also publish. In about a year after this was printed, she wrote a book called Let the Hurricane Roar, which was her fictional account of pioneer couple Charles and Caroline moving from Minnesota to South Dakota and raising crops of wheat. And it probably sounds very familiar to all of you, but it actually did sell fairly well. This is adult Rose, and that's the cover of Let the Hurricane Roar. Laura would have her own go at those same stories with the publication of On the Banks of Plum Creek. She was very annoyed that Rose had mixed up some of the chronology, because this book is set in South Dakota, but the events are those that the family experienced in Minnesota. So that did not sit very well with Laura, but
Is this book still published?
it is. It has a different title that I can't remember what it is, but you can still like get.
I think it's called Our Land.
Yeah, it's like, I think they made a movie called like Young Pioneers, but yes, you can still get this book. So by the time that Little House on the Prairie was published, she was becoming a well-known author. She was nominated for a number of Newbery Awards. So she was becoming, as these books were being published during the Great Depression, but they were still being being purchased. They were very well received by communities, by librarians, by schools. So it ended up bringing a lot of income in. So the family was finally stable in that respect. Laura did write a manuscript I mentioned at the beginning. It was called, what she called, The First 3 Years. And it covered those sort of dark years with Almanzo, with the fire, with the diphtheria. And that this would not be published during her lifetime. Eventually, Laura was given an award named after herself to acknowledge the lifetime contributions that she did to children's literature. When she finally published her last book, These Happy Golden Years, in 1943, that was it for her. She felt like she had finally done what she had set out to do. She had memorialized her family's experiences. She had created this legacy for Charles, which was something that she always wanted to do, because, you know, although he was a man who worked hard and long his entire life, he didn't really have much. When he died, they basically had the house in De Smet, and that was about it. So she really felt, and she was at this point in her late 70s, so she didn't do much touring or traveling, but she really felt like she had done the work that she had wanted to do. She died in 1957. The rights of the Little House books went to Rose, with the caveat that on Rose's death, the rights of the books were to transfer to the Laura Ingalls Library in Mansfield, Missouri. Rose renewed the copyright for the first 6 Little House books at the end of her life, and she renewed them in her own name. And what that meant is that they became a part of her estate. And when Rose died, her estate was willed to a man by the name of Roger Lee McBride. Rose, who I mentioned never had any children, had a tendency to pick up proteges as she would go on in her life. So she would meet young men, she would raise them up, she would, pay for them to go to school, and that kind of thing. And Roger Lee McBride was the son of one of her editors. Roger had never met Laura ever during his lifetime, but he got the rights of the Little House books, and he was the one who published the first 4 years in 1971, and it was not well received because it was never edited. It didn't have the Rose Wilder touch to it. Laura never intended it to be published because it did really, include a number of depressing details. And Roger Lee McBride also was the producer of the 1970s television show, Little House on the Prairie. So he made a lot of money from Laura. So here's a photograph of Laura and Almanzo in their old age at the Rocky Ridge farm.
She's adorable.
Yes, she is. Very, like I said, very small, only about, yes. That's the one thing that I think always gets through. And so these books we have now today, they, like I said, have been continuously in print since the 1930s. They continually capture all of our imaginations, and they, really are representative of that pioneer movement that built our country. So I guess any questions? Oh, many questions. Yes,
So a while back, and I think it was probably in the last year or so, the book Prairie Fires, maybe it was called,
Yes, I have that right here.
was written by who and,
This was written by Carolyn Fraser.
okay, and how, and it's, tell us about that.
Okay, so this is the biography about Laura Ingalls Wilder, if you're interested in reading it. Carolyn Fraser, I believe, is just a let's see. Yeah, she is just a scholar of sorts. This book,
She was not connected to the family?
no, she was not connected to the family. Before this, there's a biography by, I think, Donald Zoshert, I think, that's much shorter than this, and it basically covers the family's travels. This book really gets into what was happening during the country, during the travels. This also has significant content about Rose Wilder Lane, which I very much skimmed over. I could do a whole separate talk on Rose Wilder Lane. She lived a long, active, interesting life. So if you're interested in what Rose was doing, definitely check this out because she traveled all over the world. She was one of the first reporters in Vietnam in '65, which was only about 3 years before she died. So she was constantly going all over the world and.
But I think I heard that author on the radio, an interview or something, and it almost sounded like it was a blasphemous attack on Laura, no?
Okay, so I think that's a little harsh, I think. I don't necessarily think that it was a blasphemous attack, but it definitely, it was not shy in the difficult relationship between Rose and Laura. It was not shy away from the way that the land was made clear for the pioneers. But I do think this is really very informative book about the life.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Sure.
Thanks so much.
Yes.
What happened to Roger McBride? Is he still alive?
No, Roger McBride died in '95, I think. And I went to.
What happened to that, since he owned them?
Yeah, I was trying to find out who owned the rights. I'm assuming the publisher does now, or I don't think it's owned by a foundation of sorts.
Heirs to him? To his heirs?
No, I don't think that it's owned by any of his heirs. But yeah, I was trying to look that up, and I did not find a clear answer on that.
By the way, the owner of the estate is Abigail McBride.
Oh, it is a McBride?
Roger's daughter.
Okay, yeah, good to know. It is owned.
Entering the public domain pretty soon.
Yeah.
Books.
The books. So it is owned by the McBride family still. You're welcome.
So when you were up in this month,
Yeah.
did you go did you stay in the wagons, Tarragon wagons?
No, we actually stayed in De Smet.
Because we were going to do that. We could.
Yeah, so it's actually really entertaining. The trip between Pepin, Wisconsin, Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and De Smet is something that can be done in a long weekend. They're not that far apart from each other. And they actually have it, there's events at Walnut Grove and South Dakota, and they have it scheduled so that you can do the Walnut Grove things on Saturday and the De Smet things on Sunday. And you'll see the same people at each place, because each place only has one hotel because there's nothing out here. So in De Smet, The bank that Charles did his banking at is actually a bed and breakfast. So we stayed in the bank in the town of De Smet.
Did you ever go up to where Armanzo was born in New York?
No, I haven't done that yet. That is the one thing. Yes, I have not visited the home of Almanzo in New York. Yeah, it's like upstate New York, right?
Oh, yeah, up to the very tip of New York. I mean, it's almost into Canada.
Yeah, I have not, that's the one thing I have not done.
It's about, I don't know, 8 hours. I think.
Yeah, yes.
I happen to have any information on what happened to Carrie.
Okay, so good question. So Laura actually outlived all of her siblings. So
Died in what year?
she died in 57. She was 90. Charles died first, and then I think Mary, and then Caroline. Grace, the youngest one, was the next to die. Grace, Carrie, and Laura all suffered from complications with diabetes. And yes, Grace died first. Her and her husband lived in De Smet. He was a farmer. They basically lived what you could probably expect to be. She didn't really travel. She didn't do much. Laura and Grace were never that close. And also Laura didn't like how much Grace and her husband relied on the New Deal. So yeah, Laura was really not into that. So Grace died first. Carrie dabbled in some of the newspaper business. So she did some reporting. And then so she was the next to die. So she, again, farmer, I think her husband was a farmer, but also did some work in journalism. I think they were in Iowa when she died.
Did you say if Mary ever married?
No, Mary never married. Mary finished school from the Iowa College of the Blind and then went home to live with Carrie. Carrie was the one caring for Mary after she returned. Carrie and Caroline, and then just Grace and Carrie. Yes?
I'm up to about 3 questions now.
Okay.
Sounds like, just from what you just said, that the TV show kind of took some creative license.
Haha, the TV show took a lot of creative licenses, but yes.
Walnut Grove, and the restaurant was attached to the store.
Uh-huh.
So they kind of took a bunch of things, it seems like.
Yes, so the TV show did take place in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. I think the entire show took place there. Clearly you can see that was not super accurate. Some of, I think, the early stuff was not completely outrageous, but the show was on for 9 seasons. So by the end, from what I understand, Michael Landon started like recycling plots from Bonanza a lot. They also added like a bunch of orphans that they were taking care of that were never, I think there was a Cousin Albert that's not a person.
The next thing is, did I understand that Rose maybe didn't do the licensing or registering or whatever the way her mother had wanted it?
Right, so Laura intended for the rights to Little House on the Prairie to revert to the library in Mansfield, Missouri, which at that point had been named after her. And I think the library attempted to sue at one point to get the rights back, but wasn't able to, because she, like I said, Rose renewed the copyright in her own name, which made it part of her estate, and she willed her estate to Roger Lee McBride.
And the last one was, how long did you get to take on your trip to do this?
It was probably about a week and a half, because we started in Burr Oak, Iowa at the Masters Hotel, and then did Pepin, Walnut Grove, De Smet, and then we drove all the way south to Kansas. And that drive is long. We actually stopped in Red Cloud, Nebraska, which is just at the border between Kansas and Nebraska. And Red Cloud is actually where Willa Cather lived, who was, again, writing about things, writing at the same time period as Laura was. So Red Cloud is in just in that area and has some interesting things to see as well. There's homes of hers as well before we made the final drive to Independence and then back out to Mansfield, Missouri to see, because all of their, if you're interested in seeing like actual Laura Ingalls like memorabilia and her belongings, they're all in Mansfield. So that's because that's where they lived and that's where they died. And so Pa's fiddle is there in the museum. So if that's the kind of thing you're interested in, that's where you'll want to visit, yes.
So that house that's off the scenic byway, is that a?
The homestead in Desmet?
It was in the pictures.
Not this one?
No.
Oh, the home in town.
Well, if you are driving out.
This one. The one in Desmet?
Yeah, so if you're on the Laura Ingalls
Mhm.
Scenic Highway and you go north, if you are allowed to, is that home, is it a museum like with their belongings in it or no?
So it is open, it is a museum. I'm not sure how many of the belongings in that house are original to the family, because I'm assuming that house like had many people, because the Rocky Ridge Farm became a museum I think almost immediately after Laura died. So the house in Missouri this house is like exactly the way they left it.
And she stayed there till she died?
Yes, this is the house that Laura and Almanzo basically lived in their entire adult lives, and it is exactly as they left it. So if you're interested in that sort of thing and seeing like all of the belongings that they had, this is where you'll want to go, because that's where. And then the rock house is there as well.
And is that part of the museum?
Yes, this is you can walk to between these two places. So, and the rock house is interesting because Rose had lots of like there was like modern electricity in it and stuff. And I think there was like a fire in the house at one point because that's the kind of unlucky lives they lived. But yeah, that was a house that Rose built.